Okay, thank you for the invitation and the nice introduction. The title of my talk and my contact information is here. I'll have it again at the end. But what I wanted to do with this presentation was using my forestry background, think about ways we could change the potential to accumulate biomass for forest types in Utah. And I'll admit from the outset that I'm already breaking J.L. Laughlin's rule, and I have my own definition of biomass, and you're just going to have to work with me through the presentation on that. A basic outline, we tend to think about what's on the ground now and doing treatments and getting an effect, and then we leave, we're all done, we've restored. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a modeling approach and look at what's going to happen when we mess around in forested stands, doing thinning treatments, removing biomass, changing growth dynamics over time. To do that, we need to have a little bit of basic understanding in growth and yield relationships. So think back to your natural resources training. If you've had it, that should be textbook stuff. Then I'll use a modeling approach and apply this to some forest types in Utah, although I won't go over all of them today. And a little bit of emphasis on Pinyon-Juniper, and I'll tell you why when I get there. So the background. Basic growth and yield relationships. Over time, the growth of a particular stand on a particular site follows this really formal sigmoidal relationship. So it starts to increase slowly, then very rapidly. But then at some point, the inflection there, after it increases at its most rapid rate, growth slows down over time. And based on many, many years of research, we know this occurs predictably during certain times of stand development. So we have increasing stand density, a closing of the canopy. These are all things we can measure, have been quantified. Another way to think about this growth rate is just to differentiate that sigmoidal growth curve. And what we get is this growth rate over time. And you'll notice that those of you that have had calculus probably understand this relationship. That point where the growth curve is increasing at its most rapid rate, if we differentiate that curve and look at the rate of growth over time, we'll see that's where the growth rate is the highest. So that might be, if we're interested in managing for increased accumulation, we might think about focusing, maintaining our stands somewhere near that maximum growth rate. So that's the basis for doing management intervention if we're going to try and maximize growth rate. We can do this by judiciously controlling density or yield at a particular time. I would suggest where the growth rate is the fastest, removing total growth and trying to maintain that particular forest at its highest growth potential, and we might be able to do that multiple times. Now, clearly, we're reducing the overall yield for that particular area, but the idea is that by leaving the growth potential on selected individuals, we might make up for that trade-off by maximizing the growth of what we leave behind, which could be desirable. And then I'm going to make this comment that this overall level varies by the potential productivity of the site. And that's going to come into play when I do some modeling. On the ground, we do this through thinning, whether we choose what we thin, whether we choose what we're leaving on the site. And I've plotted up this simple curve here to show that we tend to use a relative stand density index, some relative index of density on the site. It's predetermined, typically species specific. We know these things for western forest types. And what we want to do is we want to lower the total density so that the stands don't slow in growth, but try and maintain individual tree growth potential as close to 100% as we can. And here I'm going to use, for my modeling purposes, 35% of maximum, of relative stand density index. So in general, the questions for my project: can we increase the growth rates for some popular, some of the more widespread Utah forest types by thinning, and then specifically Pinyon-Juniper. And we'll investigate these over a couple of different site qualities. And with the juniper, since we don't have a quantified metric of site quality, I've broken them into elevation classes. So we'll break down the PJ further by elevation class to explore this relationship. I'm going to do this using the forest inventory and analysis data from the most recent full annual inventory that encompasses the years 2000 to 2009. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import this data into the forest vegetation simulator. This is a very complex growth model, and one of the benefits of this model, besides quantifying what's on the stand now, is that it will simulate growth, mortality, growth response to thinning over time, and give us quantitative output to assess. And so here's a Douglas fir stand growing over time. And this is just a graphical rendering that comes out of FVS. For those of you that aren't familiar with FVS, it is the federally supported growth and yield model for the country. There are different variants. Each of them do things differently based on the input from people within those variants. I've been heavily involved with many variants, but Utah specifically, and I'm happy to say that our model does quite well in modeling growth over time. It's been validated. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take stands from the FIA data that are fully stocked and run a no action alternative. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to let them grow over time. Then we're going to take the exact same stand and we're going to thin it to 35% of relative density. We're going to decrease the competition between individuals in an attempt to increase the growth over time. And then what we're going to do is repeat that same thing for low and high site productivity potential. So in forestry, we tend to measure that with site index. And I'll come up with a proxy for that for Pinyon-Juniper. So we have this cluster of management outcomes. And going into this, I have these hypotheses based off the literature that the moist sites would be more productive in general than the xeric sites. These are obviously informed by observation and also theory. And in the West, we know that that's typically elevation. But that potential productivity is going to also control this relationship, so that I would hypothesize that sites with higher potential productivity would both have a higher overall biomass accumulation rate than the lower sites. A little bit of the accounting. In terms of counting the accumulation of biomass over time, what I've done is when we do the thinning, I count that as part of the biomass in my total accounting for the biomass accumulation over time. This is a common thing in the carbon world. Depending, the corollary to this might be whether it's counted as long-term storage or whether it's used as fuel. It'd be considered fossil fuel neutral. This doesn't directly pertain to biomass use, but this is the way you would think about it in the carbon world. Essentially, what happens to the wood when it drives off the site. So the results, these are the averages by forest types for the state of Utah in tons per acre on the x-axis there, and I'll just leave this up for a minute. I've got them arranged by total biomass, but in the green, it's still green, we can see That's the standing live. The brown is the surface fuel. And then the orange is the standing dead. So in general, we can see that the elevation and the moisture relationship holds. In Utah, the forests with the most standing biomass are higher elevation. We have spruce, spruce fir, white fir, and it goes down to our least productive sites, juniper, oaks, mountain mahogany, but still have a significant amount of biomass. I'll make a note that even though I'm focusing on Pinyon-Juniper, you'll notice it's next to the bottom on the list in terms of average biomass in the state. But it turns out, in terms of acreage, this is by far the largest forest type. So there's more workable land. Okay, and what I'm going to do for the results is I'm going to work through an example with Douglas fir and get to my final metric before showing you the results from pinyon pine. On the left, you'll see the graphical rendering of the Douglas fir stand, a type of Douglas fir stand, high quality, site index 70, that I modeled to calculate biomass accumulation rates. The blue line is the no action scenario, and then the red line is the thinning scenario. And we can see that the no action behaves like we would expect ecologically. It's continuing to increase in biomass, but at a decreasing rate. And the thinning clearly has a thinning effect. But after thinning, begins to accumulate. And what we're interested in is whether that, essentially the slope of those lines, after thinning, is that accumulation rate more rapid than the no action scenario. So another way to think about that is just to calculate those biomass accumulation rates over time. So here's the annual biomass accumulation rate. The colors are the same. The blue is the no action, the red is the thinning. And what we see is that after the drastic loss from the thinning, the stand begins to accumulate biomass at a faster rate than the no action and continues to until the end of this rotation. So it appears as if that thinning actually had an increased and a sustained effect. Another way to look at this would be to just subtract the output from the thinning scenario from the no action scenario. And that's all this graph is. And this is how I'm going to present the results for the rest of the presentation. What we see here is the annual biomass accumulation rate due to thinning compared to the control for this site. So we can actually increase the growth rate over the long term by conducting just this one thinning in Douglas fir. I didn't repeat this type of analysis with multiple thinnings. As these stands grow after thinning and close their canopies again, they'll begin to slow in growth, just like the no action scenario. So there's room there, but that's in the long term. I just put up aspen because a lot of people are interested in aspen. Thanks. Here, instead of looking at the difference between no action and thinning, I just have plotted the equivalent of this graph here, the growth rate difference due to thinning, for a high quality aspen site and a low quality aspen site. And those numbers are real. I decided what was high and low quality based off what we measured from the FIA data. So these are reasonable in terms of what's on the landscape. And what we see is somewhat predictable. The high site increased biomass accumulation over zero sooner than the low site. So that's consistent with one of my hypotheses. And then crashes sooner, or goes back down near zero. And I think we're looking at a model here over time, so we can take these results with a grain of salt. But I think in aspen stands, what we're looking at is rapid canopy closure followed by falling apart of the stand. And so I think I can explain why these curves crash and then begin to build again. But in general, this is consistent with the hypothesis. Moving on to the pinyon-juniper, remember we're dealing with this part of these stands here, not Rocky Mountain juniper and not pure juniper, but what we classify as PJ, so there's some component of pinyon and juniper in all of these stands. This is where they're located in Utah. And I've broken them apart because there are so many. And because we don't have a metric for site quality, I've broken them apart by elevation band so that we can pick apart potential differences in their growth rate. And I apologize for the colors. It just doesn't look as good as the computer screen. But we have 7 bands here, low to high elevation. And there are the results for average biomass from all of those plots here, broken apart by the elevation bands. Next to the elevation band is the sample size from the FIA inventory for those plots. And what you can see is that in general, the pinyon follow the elevational rule, where they have nearly twice the biomass at the higher elevations than the low elevations. Something's going on at those high elevations, and I think it might be due to other species mixed in with that. Also a sample size issue. But we can go ahead and repeat the same modeling analysis for each of these elevation bands and look at the growth, the biomass accumulation potential for each of these classes. So the lowest elevation class, high productivity site and a low productivity site, we see that we barely we're mostly near zero most of the time. So only the high quality class goes above zero, and it takes many decades to get there. So it seems like at low elevation, thinning might not have much growth response. And people who've been on the ground probably understand where this is coming from. Low moisture, low growth rates to begin with, probably really low response in growth. We move up in elevation, we see a bit of an increase for both the low and high quality sites, perhaps a little bit more for the high quality sites, and it's sustained over time. Moving up again, a little bit more increase and perhaps a bit higher for the high quality sites, like I hypothesized. Getting higher, and it looks like here the high quality sites definitely respond better, but the low quality sites do. They take a little bit longer, and the response might not be sustained. Moving up to the next class, we see that the high quality is quite a bit higher than the low quality and sustained, but the low quality does have an increase. It just occurs much later. Let's see, the next to last class, we're starting to see maybe where the low quality sites might have a better response than the high quality sites, although it might occur later after the thinning. But in this case, both the low and the high quality sites have a little bit better accumulation rate than doing nothing. And then for the highest elevation class, we see this interesting result, much like the low elevation class, no response or even a lack of response until much further in time. But still with the high sites responding a little bit better than the low sites. So that's a little bit messy, and I think one way to think about this is this conceptual diagram I came up with based on those results in general, with a y-axis in tons per acre per year based on the results. Generally, the high-quality sites will yield higher growth rate potential after management than the low in all cases. But it appears as if they did so, the peak of that potential was a little bit lower in elevation than the low-quality sites. So this is something that needs to be explored further since we don't have a strong grasp of site quality in Pinyon-Juniper. This is something that begs further explanation. In conclusion, overall, the results of the models suggest that we can increase the rate of biomass accumulation over time. Remember, we're not increasing total stand yield, but potential yield over time, the rate of growth by thinning. And that this varies by site productivity. And that the details in the Pinyon-Juniper stands did differ by site productivity, but there was probably a larger or more predictable difference by those elevational classes that I arbitrarily created. So that's it for my talk. Before I take questions, I want to put a plug in for the Forest Inventory and Analysis state reports. We're going to be having 3 states coming up in the next year or 2. We'll finish these annual reports based off FIA data. And we have stakeholder meetings where we bring people from the states who are interested in particular resource objectives, aspen, Pinyon-Juniper, whatever. We invite you to those meetings to tell us what you want to see in the report. Some of these reports from the last inventory are out on Paul Rogers' Aspen Alliance table. If they're all gone, you can fill your name in and we'll send you a copy. If you're interested in joining a stakeholder meeting, you can email me or my boss, and we'll put you on the list. So I think that's the end of my presentation, so I'll take any questions if there's time.